Morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to be here. You know, we had a long discussion in Tax Committee again yesterday about the idea of the school shift. Is the governor's unallotment, is it a school payment shift? Is it a payment delay? And then I noticed the governor in some of his comments this week suggested that after the forecast that, well, the deficit really isn't $5.8 billion. It's really $3 billion, he said. So now the assumptions you have to make for the governor to assume a $3 billion shift is schools aren't going to get paid back. So to me, what that means is that's a cut. And I think the governor and the members of the legislature ought to just be honest with that. I mean, the governor's spreadsheet does not show the schools being paid back in the next biennium. And so what I'm going to propose today, I'm introducing a bill today, is codifying that school payment shift in law, that the legislature is going to commit to pay the school shift back, and in more than just language. I'm going to propose extending the sales tax to clothing and using the money to committing $120 million of the money to pay back the school shift. And then with the balance of the money, I'm going to reduce the general sales tax rate by 1/4%. So that's the proposal. It very closely mirrors the recommendations of the governor's own 21st Century Commission, his appointed group that said the state should look at expanding the sales tax to some items. They didn't specifically name anything. So I'm simply proposing that on July 1st, we'll extend the sales tax to clothing. And in the first year, it will raise $257 million. I'm proposing that we use that to, the Finance Committee use that to mitigate the budget, the short-term deficit, and that on July 1st next year, we start paying back the school shift at $120 million a year, and we reduce the general sales tax rate by 1/4%. So that is really the proposal, and look forward to your questions. Pretty simple.
Why put the sales tax on clothing? Why that particular move?
Well, people have been talking about that around here for a long time, the idea of extending the sales tax and cutting the rate. And it's just an issue that's been around for a long time. And it's interesting, the sales tax on clothing actually is much less regressive than the general sales tax by itself. Significantly less regressive. So when you expand the sales tax to clothing and cut the general rate on everything else, you actually make Minnesota's sales tax system less regressive than it is today.
Can you explain why?
Because people with higher incomes buy more clothing and more expensive clothing. And lower income people, the sales tax is generally regressive, and they just don't buy as much clothing and they buy less of it. It's interesting, if you divide the state into the population deciles, about 250,000 households in each one, the top 10% of households are actually going to pay 31% of the tax. And I think that handout's probably in the packet that you received.
Was this an idea that you floated with other legislators, and what sort of support or opposition do you expect?
No, I just made actually Senator Poggemiller aware of this yesterday. The bill's getting a number today. I'm the only author. This is just me. This is not a position of the Senate caucus. I haven't talked to members of the Senate Tax Committee about it. Although if you've been following the discussions of the Senate Tax Committee, there is some bipartisan support for looking at an expansion of the sales tax. So I do think in the Senate Tax Committee, at least, there's some bipartisan support to consider something like this. But I'll just be real clear, though. This is just me. I don't want, please don't characterize this as somehow being a proposal from the DFL caucus. I haven't talked to the caucus about it. I haven't even asked anybody to consider if they would author it with me. But somebody needs to have this discussion. You know, previous governors, back to when I was in high school, when the state has had a financial crisis, have considered some revenue. And I think of Governor Anderson certainly did in '71 when the Minnesota Miracle was born. And certainly Governor Quee was well known for an income tax surcharge when in the 81-82 recession, and Perpich and Arnie Carlson also, and even Governor Ventura going out the door, you remember in his last session when you could see a deficit on the planning horizon, suggested the big plan. So it's something that previous governors back to when I was in school have always, when the state has had a financial crisis, been willing to consider some revenue. I would argue this isn't even a tax increase. It's actually a cut. I mean, I'm proposing to cut the general sales tax rate.
The governor said, this governor said yesterday, in reference actually to your Viking Stadium plan, that flat out we don't do tax increases. What would make you think this would be any different?
Well, I think we have to. I just think the state has to have the discussion about, you know, the governor can't have it both ways. He can't say that it's a payment delay to schools, and then, you know, the truth is it's a cut. There is no provision in law that is going to pay back the schools their $1.2 billion aid shift. It's not going to happen. The only way schools are going to be paid that money back is if the legislature appropriates the money. It's a cut. So it would be helpful, I think, if everybody would just be honest about the fact that it's not a payment delay, it's not a shift, there's no provision in law that schools are going to be paid this money back. This bill will not only put the provision in law that they're going to be paid back at $120 million a year, it would provide the money to do it.
Paying this back in $120 million increments, what are the property tax implications of this?
Well, I suspect there'll probably be, if schools get $120 million a year, it's less likely schools would have to go out and look, some schools anyway, would have to go out and look for voter-approved operating levies. So I do think it would take some pressure off school districts in having to go out and run voter-approved levies. And certainly would take pressure off on the borrowing side. Some schools might use the new money to pay back some debt certificates that they've had to execute in order to get through the payment delays that the governor's proposed.
How long would it take to pay back the schools, and what happens with the revenue at that point?
10 years. At $120 million a year, it'll take slightly less than 10 years to pay it back. And once the schools are paid back, the bill proposes to reduce the general sales tax rate again by the same amount. So once the schools are paid back, the entire proposal is revenue neutral. The sales tax will be reduced for a second time once the schools are paid back.
Would your House chair be at all interested in this, since she is from Bloomington, Mall of America, where most of the clothing is probably sold in the state? We sent over, in fact, they're probably on her desk. I sent over the House jackets to her this morning with a cover letter from myself asking her to consider introducing the bill. And in the letter I said if she was not interested in introducing the bill to please send the jackets back to me so that I can look for another House author. But I certainly would prefer that I think I owe it to the House tax chair to give her the first opportunity to introduce the bill, and I've done that. I sent a letter to the governor this morning requesting a personal meeting with him to talk about the proposal. I think it would be helpful if he didn't immediately throw cold water on it until we at least had a chance to discuss it. And I met this morning with both the business partnership and with the Minnesota Chamber. Wouldn't Mall of America specifically, that would create a lot of pushback on this?
I think I asked Senator Moe about this last night, and I have a lot of respect for his wisdom and his counsel over the years. And he said, Tom, people think they're already paying the sales tax.
What did the chamber?
You don't include the property tax recognition shift in this payback for the schools? How come?
Because that actually is not a payment delay that schools are seeing every month. Right now, when the money's being paid out to the schools, the state is delaying part of the payment. The property tax recognition shift is just a timing issue. It's just a date change in law. Just changes from schools currently recognize their property tax payments in July, moves it up to May, and that saves the state one time some general fund money. So it's not it acts differently than an aid shift.
Is the 257 plus the 120 what you estimate the annual revenue increase to be?
The 250, because the sales tax is being put on clothing on July 1st, the state can't get the money in the first month. So in the first year, we only get 11 months of collections. So that's why it's $257 million in the first year. You'll see in the second year, it's more than that. it's 294 in the second year because there's a full 12 months that we actually collect the tax. So in the second year, when the schools get paid 120, the tax relief is about 160, a little over 165 million is the actual cut in the sales tax portion. So this is a significant tax cut to people on everything that you buy in the next fiscal year by $165.7 million of tax relief that I think is good not only for citizens but good for the business community. The business community pays a large, certainly very good for the construction industry that's very much struggling to reduce the cost of all the purchases by 1/4%.
When does it become revenue neutral, could you say?
Once the school, after the first year we're going to use the $257 million to try and help resolve the budget deficit. On July 1 of next year, schools are going to get $120 million, and taxpayers are going to see a tax cut of $165.7 million. Once the schools are paid back, no longer than 10 years from now, once the schools are paid back, then the sales tax will be reduced by the amount that was going to the schools. So once the school aid payment shift is paid back, then the proposal is totally revenue neutral. There's no new sales tax being collected. We've just changed the base, but there's no, the rate is lower, and we collect the same amount of money through the sales tax. It's just that we collect it on some different, we collect less on almost everything, and we happen to expand it to clothing.
Do you have any hope that the governor will seriously consider this because it cuts the tax? Eventually revenue neutral?
Well, it depends on if the governor's willing to take any risk. There's a lot of risk in this for me. I mean, tax increases don't poll well in a deep recession that we're in. But I'm just really concerned going forward. The more we talk about the school payment shift or delay or whatever it is, it's obvious when you look at the budget forecast from Tuesday, there is going to be no money this time next year for the next budget. Even under the governor's comments, that if you do all of his unallotments and you carry them forward and you don't pay the schools back, you still have $3 billion in a problem this time next year. So I think what we need to get honest about is there is no money to put into schools in the next biennium either. That's just the facts. There will be no money for the K-12 system. There was none in this biennium. There will be none in the next. At a minimum, the legislature should, I think, put in law the repayment of the shift. That at least will give them $120 million of new money a year going forward.
You haven't been a fan of an increase of putting the sales tax rather on clothing in the past. Why did you change your mind?
My preference, if I could be king for a day, you'd see me introduce something closer to what I tried last year. My preference is to do something on the income tax. Absolutely. That would be where I would like to go. You can look at last year's Senate tax bill. I think it's the best tax policy for the state. I'm a believer in a progressive income tax. I also understand the governor is never going to sign that into law. He's not going to do that. I have no interest in sending him a tax bill that he's going to veto. You'll notice the last night of session last year, I didn't vote for that final tax bill that went to the governor. It wasn't a negotiated deal. He's not going to sign an income tax increase, so we have a problem on our hands, and I think people need to be willing to compromise. I'm willing to compromise from my belief that we should increase the income tax, and I would hope the governor would be willing to entertain a discussion that I would argue doesn't raise taxes, it actually lowers taxes. It's going to cut our general sales tax rate, which is a significant benefit to, especially to our business community. They pay a large percentage of the sales tax that's paid in the state. The governor actually, in I think his 2008 budget, actually proposed cutting the sales tax by 1/8%. That was his proposal.
Could this affect local option sales tax? Cities and counties be able to extend clothing too?
This will, it affects local taxes to this point. The sales tax on clothing is going to be put on everything. But the cities that have a local option sales tax are going to benefit from this. They're going to get some new revenue. But in the case of Hennepin County for the Twins Stadium, that sales tax is going to be reduced. That 3/16% is actually going to be reduced so that it collects about the same amount of money, as close as we can round it. That's also true for the Metro Transit tax. That tax is going to be reduced so that it collects the same amount of money. And the same is true for the constitutional amendment sales tax, the legacy amendment. That sales tax rate will be reduced so that it collects the same amount of money. But cities that have a local option sales tax are going to have some additional money. So, and most of those are for capital projects. So those bonds will get paid off earlier because they're going to have some new revenue for that. But most local option sales taxes are committed to some capital purpose.
What did the chamber say?
They were pretty non-committal. They were pretty non-committal. I thought I owed it to them. I mean, I'm very concerned about moving forward. I don't want to do anything that damages an economic recovery. If anything, I would like to do something that stimulates the economy, that adds to a recovery earlier. So I wanted them to be aware of the proposal so that they had time to think about it in the event somebody cares to ask them what they might think. So I didn't want them to read about it in the newspaper. I think this is good for potential economic expansion because, it's like I said, in the construction industry, you hear about all these projects that owners have and they can't get them to go forward. Well, this will reduce the cost of all the construction material by 1/4%.
Are you concerned, though, if you're trying not to damage the recovery in the first full year with just recollections of sales tax on clothing, the reduction wouldn't kick in until later? How does that affect? I mean, isn't it more critical to do something cumulative now?
I'm willing to have that discussion with the governor. That's why I'd like him to not throw cold water on this. But, we've got $1 billion deficit to resolve between now and May 17th. This is my proposal to solve 1/4 of the problem through some revenue, 1/4. And the other 3/4 I expect Senator Cohen's going to have to figure out in the Finance Committee. But, I have always said there needs to be a balanced solution to solving the state's budget problems going forward. That there's going to be some new revenue, there are going to be some spending cuts, and to the extent we can do something with an economic expansion that improves our revenue stream. I mean, if lowering the sales tax leads to businesses having some additional revenue available, maybe to expand, or there's probably an economic argument to do it also.
Could you clarify the net impact of these two moves once the sales tax reduction kicks in on an annual basis?
July 1st next year, the sales tax will be on clothing, and $120 million of that money is going to go to the schools to buy back the shift, and then the balance of the money is 1/4% reduction in the sales tax. So this does not create new spending. It only pays back the school shift, and the rest of the money is spent on reducing the general sales tax rate on everything else that you buy. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Just clarify, I thought the rate was higher than 6.5 because of the legacy.
Depends on how you count it.
It's not in statute as part of the rate.
You could characterize the sales tax rate as being 6.875, or you could characterize it as being 6.5 plus the constitutional amendment. But the constitutional amendment percentage, the 0.375, is going to come down. So there's a rounding issue in there. So I wanted to keep it as simple as I could, because I expect the constitutional amendment is going to collect the same amount of money it does today. So it's going to come down from 0.375 to some number lower than that.
And the same with Hennepin County.
And the same with Hennepin County on the Twin Stadium and on the transit tax. That number also will come down. Thank you.